At 11:51 p.m., my phone lit up like a signal flare against the dark. A message from my mother, Evelyn Collins. 10 words that rearranged the air in my apartment. We have agreed that you are no longer part of the family. No greeting. No hesitation. Just finality in digital ink. Seconds later, my sister Claire reacted to the message with a heart. That single tap of approval said everything. Betrayal was no longer whispered behind my back. It was stamped and endorsed. I sat in my small one-bedroom apartment in downtown Chicago, the glow from the screen reflecting off my coffee mug. The streets below were quiet, only the faint hum of traffic rolling down Michigan Avenue. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let the silence stretch until it felt like a new kind of air I had to breathe. Then I did what I do best. I acted. For years, I had been the quiet backbone of our family. I paid the electric bill for the Beacon Hill house in Boston, the one with the black shutters and red brick that had belonged to my grandfather, Henry Collins. I covered the insurance on my father Thomas's Range Rover. When property taxes came due, I handled them. I even covered the $380 monthly payment for the gardener and the $1,140 home warranty that kept their systems humming. Every expense that made their world smooth passed through my hands. I didn't do it out of guilt or weakness. I did it because my grandfather had once told me, families survive on the person who remembers the small things. He meant me. At 11:56 p.m., I opened my laptop. The screen glowed like an open stage. I started canceling one account at a time. Electric, off. Gas, off. Internet, off. The gardener would get an apologetic email. The home warranty, not renewed. Each cancellation was a clean break, a thread cut from the tangled web I had been trapped in. I created a folder on my desktop and named it October Evidence. Inside, I began saving screenshots, payment receipts, account transfers, statements that bore my name. Every dollar I had sent their way, I documented it. There were hundreds. Some were small, $28 for furnace filters. Others were heavy, $4, $800 to cover a missed mortgage payment my father forgot to mention. When I was done, the total on my screen made my stomach twist. I had poured over $120,000 into a family that just erased me with a single message. At 12:03 a.m., I picked up my phone and called Daniel Price, my attorney in Chicago. He had handled a messy business dissolution for me the year before and understood the calm precision I liked to keep. The call went to voicemail. I spoke clearly. "Daniel, it's Lauren. My family cut me off in writing tonight. I've been managing their accounts for years. I think there's something wrong with my grandfather's trust. Call me at 8. I set my phone face down. I made a cup of chamomile tea, though it tasted like nothing. The walls of my apartment hummed with the radiator's soft tick, the rhythm of quiet betrayal. I thought of the Beacon Hill house, the brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, the staircase polished smooth by generations of footsteps, the smell of my grandfather's pipe tobacco still lingering in the wood. He had promised me, years ago, that the house would one day be mine. "You love this place the way I do," he said. "It will find its way to you." But since his death, the ownership records had turned into a maze of shifting names. My parents always said it was family restructuring, yet every change made me feel smaller in the equation. At 12:30, I backed up all my files to a portable drive and slipped it into a shoebox under my bed. Then I opened a blank document and typed a single line. "I don't need their approval to act. I only need the facts." That sentence felt like a pulse. When I woke at 7, Chicago was gray and sharp-edged. The city was already moving, unaware that my life had quietly split in two. I showered, dressed, and brewed another cup of coffee I barely tasted. At 8 on the dot, my phone rang. Daniel's calm voice came through the speaker. "Bring everything," he said. "Bank records, receipts, the text, even the heart reaction. I want it all. I'll bring in Nora Blake. She's a forensic accountant. If there's fraud, she'll find it. If the trust was tampered with, we'll prove it." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. After we hung up, I sat for a long minute staring at the skyline. Glass towers, slick with fog, caught the weak light. They looked like cold witnesses to everything unspoken. I opened my email and forwarded Daniel the files. Each attachment felt like a piece of my history. The bills, the bank statements, the years of quiet servitude disguised as duty. Then I packed my briefcase with the printed copies and my old notebook full of handwritten reminders from the past 5 years. Mom's insurance renewal, Dad's car lease, trust tax deadline, Claire's tuition help. The notebook felt heavier than it should. Before leaving my apartment, I looked around at the things that were mine. My mahogany desk from a vintage shop, the black and white photographs I took in Seattle, the painting of a woman standing alone under a street lamp. Everything I owned, I earned. Everything I gave, they took. It was 8:47 when I stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air. The city was loud now, alive. A delivery truck honked, and somewhere a siren wailed. But underneath it all, I felt an odd calm, like the eye of a storm that had finally reached me. By the time I reached Daniel's office on LaSalle Street, I already knew the truth. I had not lost my family that night. I had simply been shown what it really was. My mother's message had been meant to humiliate me. Instead, it unlocked something steadier, quieter, more dangerous than anger. It gave me clarity. What they called exile, I called beginning. And as I rode the elevator up to Daniel's office, I realized something else. The same precision I once used to keep their lives comfortable was about to become the precision that unraveled their lies. The clock in the lobby read 9:02 a.m. when the doors opened. I stepped out, ready to start the real work. Emotional exile had been swift. My answer would be slower and exact. By noon, I stood inside Daniel's glass-walled office on LaSalle Street, clutching a thick folder, a portable drive, and a lukewarm coffee that had long lost its flavor. His assistant ushered me in, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and gestured toward the long oak conference table. Daniel rose to greet me with the same calm he always carried, as if no problem in the world could rattle his composure. "Lauren," he said, motioning for me to sit. "This is Nora Blake, the forensic accountant I mentioned." Nora looked nothing like what I expected. She was in her early 50s, sharp but unhurried, with silver-rimmed glasses and a tone that carried quiet authority. She gave me a brief nod, the kind that said, "You've already done the hardest part, showing up." We spread everything out across the table: statements, receipts, scanned PDFs, old emails, screenshots of online payments. The paper formed a mosaic of years: gas, electricity, insurance, taxes, house repairs, and unending maintenance costs that had kept the family's world spinning. Nora moved through the records with methodical grace. She asked no unnecessary questions. When she found something off, she didn't react loudly. She simply drew a small red line beside the entry. After an hour, the first real crack appeared. 2 wire transfers for $12,000 each. I had labeled them as contractor help for my mother 2 years ago when she claimed the Beacon Hill house needed urgent roof work. But the account number wasn't for a contractor. It was Claire's, a private account in New York. Nora's pen stopped. She looked up, her calm eyes sharpening. "You didn't authorize these beyond sending the funds, correct?" "No," I said. She told me the invoice had to be handled immediately. I trusted her. Nora jotted something down. "That's what fraud looks like when it's dressed like family." She then pulled out a trust document, my grandfather Henry's trust, the one that had always been at the center of our family's wealth. She flipped through the original pages, signed 15 years ago in Boston. The document was clear. The Beacon Hill house was to pass to me upon Henry's death, with a clause allowing my mother to stay in the guest room if she wished. The taxes and maintenance were to be paid from a trust account, not from personal funds. But that account was nearly empty. My debit card, however, showed years of consistent withdrawals covering those same expenses. "There's something else," Nora said, turning to the last page of a property file. "Someone recorded a deed 2 years ago, transferring partial control of the property to your father." I leaned closer. "That's impossible. My grandfather never gave him that right." Nora nodded slowly. "It's not just impossible, it's sloppy. The notary listed is one of your sister's college friends." "And the witness?" a woman who moved to London a full year before this document was signed. She slid the page toward me. This was manufactured. I sat back, pulse quickening. It wasn't just betrayal now. It was a crime, wearing the mask of family duty. Daniel read through the document, silent for several minutes. Then he looked up. "We're going to Boston," he said simply. That afternoon, he filed for a temporary restraining order in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. The motion was clean and surgical. He requested the court freeze any sale, refinancing, or transfer of the Beacon Hill property. He also sought to block all withdrawals from the trust until a hearing could be held. In his affidavit, he included every proof: my mother's text, Claire's heart reaction, and the complete timeline of payments I had made. "Once the order is granted," Daniel said, "we'll subpoena the bank, the title company, and anyone involved in the trust's handling. If there's foul play, we'll have it in writing within the week." That evening, we flew out of O'Hare on a late flight to Boston. I paid for my own ticket. I didn't want them to cover a single cent of my fight. By the time we landed, the air was sharp and cold. I checked into a small hotel near the public garden, a place that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood polish. I dropped my bags and walked the few blocks to Beacon Hill just before sunset. The street was the same as I remembered: narrow, cobblestone, lined with antique lamps that glowed a soft amber. When I reached the house, I stopped across the street. The windows were lit. Through the glass, I could see a vase of white lilies on the hall table. My mother always loved lilies. I used to bring her some every year on her birthday. I stood there, hands buried in my coat pockets, watching shadows move inside. They were probably at dinner, talking about me. I placed my palm on the cold brick and whispered, "You won't be a prize in their game." The next morning, we entered the courthouse. The halls smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Judge Helena Carter presided over the motion hearing. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned neatly and eyes that gave nothing away. Daniel presented our case with precision. He laid out the payments, the canceled bills, and the wire transfers to Claire. He explained the quiet deed, the irregular notary, and the missing funds from the trust. Each point landed with quiet force. Judge Carter asked questions, sharp, specific ones. Who managed this trust after Mr. Collins' pass? Why did the account deplete so drastically? And why did this young woman's personal funds substitute for what was legally required from the trust? When Daniel finished, the courtroom was silent. My parents weren't there, but their attorney was. He tried to argue family misunderstanding, but the judge's expression stayed still as stone. By noon, the ruling came. All property transfers and sales were frozen for 30 days. The bank was ordered to produce full statements within a week. The title company had to submit every page of the closing file for the fraudulent deed. The trustee was to appear with ledgers and full accountings. And I was granted permission to file a lease pendens, a legal notice preventing any sale or loan against the property. Nora smiled faintly beside me. "Paper doesn't lie," she said. "People do." Outside the courthouse, snow had begun to fall, thin, soft flakes catching the afternoon light. I tilted my face up and let them melt against my skin. The war my family had started with a message was now moving into a courtroom. But for the first time in years, I wasn't the one holding them together. I was the one holding the proof. And that, finally, felt like justice beginning to breathe. The calls began that same night. My phone buzzed until the screen went dark from exhaustion. First, my father's voice, heavy with false calm, slid through the speaker. "Lauren, this is unnecessary. You've made your point. Let's be reasonable." When that failed to land, the next message turned sharp. "You have no right to meddle in matters that don't concern you." Then came my mother's text, just one line. "How could you be so cruel?" And finally, Claire's message, a simple thumbs-down emoji. No words. No heart this time. Just a digital sneer. I stared at the screen for a long while before powering it off. I had spent years keeping their world afloat, paying bills, renewing insurance, managing tax deadlines, maintaining a house they never thanked me for. They called my silence weakness, but that night, it was armor. Silence wasn't cruel. Silence was clean. The next morning, Nora and Daniel met me in a Boston cafe near Copley Square. The table was crowded with papers, folders, and coffee cups that had gone cold from neglect. Nora was deep in her audit of the trust accounts, a mechanical pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked up with that same steady composure she always carried. "I've gone through the trust transactions for the last 5 years," she said. "It's worse than we thought." She turned her screen toward me. There it was, line after line of withdrawals and transfers. The trust had been bled dry, not by accident but by design. Payments marked as home repair had been diverted to a private business account under my father's name. That account had seen frequent withdrawals, most of them coinciding with casino visits in Connecticut. "Your mother authorized several of these transfers," Nora added quietly. "And look here." She zoomed in on one entry. "A condo in New York. Paid in full, $720,000. The beneficiary?"
She didn't need to say it.
I saw the name, Claire Collins. The room felt smaller. The cafe chatter faded until only the faint hum of the espresso machine filled the air. I remembered the story my mother told me 2 years ago about Claire finally earning her own apartment. I had congratulated her, even sent her a bottle of champagne. Nora went on, her tone crisp but kind. "Your mother had your cards saved for recurring payments. She labeled them household support. It looks like she reactivated it every few months under new names, service fees, maintenance, home warranty. All are redirected to cover their personal shortfalls." I leaned back, the anger quiet but alive. So they built a life on money they pretended came from thin air. Daniel nodded. "We'll use this. Every transaction. Every name." He was already drafting a new motion. "We'll ask the court to remove your father as trustee. We'll also request reimbursement for the full amount you paid, plus damages." He glanced up from his laptop. "Lauren, this is no longer about emotion. This is about record-keeping. And right now, your record is spotless." While the legal machinery turned, I started building a small version of my life again. I kept my Chicago apartment, but sublet it for a few months. I spent more time in Boston, working from a borrowed desk at a design agency near Back Bay. The pay wasn't glamorous, $6,500 a month, but it was mine. Every morning before work, I walked through the public garden, watching the swan boats glide across the pond. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't filled with to-do lists for other people. In the evenings, I visited the Beacon Hill house from across the street. I would stand beneath the gas lamps, watching the light flicker against the red brick. I imagined the sound of my grandfather's voice echoing through the hallways, steady, kind, disappointed if he could see what his legacy had become. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, Nora called with the tone that meant something big. "We've got the closing file," she said. "You'll want to see this." When I arrived, she had the documents laid out across the table like a crime scene. She pointed at the notary's stamp. "Expired 6 months before this deed was signed." She flipped another page. "The witness, out of the country during that week." And here, she handed me an email printed in black and white. My father's name filled the sender line. It read, "Please just finalize. Family matter. No need to bother my daughter." Nora circled it in red. "Fraud in creation," she said softly, "and fraud in execution." I didn't speak. There was nothing to add. The proof was its own voice. Daniel filed an amended petition within 24 hours. The new filing demanded the immediate removal of my father as trustee, restitution of $128,640 to me, and reinstatement of the trust's original clause, transferring full ownership of the Beacon Hill property to me, as my grandfather had intended. When the final hearing was scheduled, I expected nerves. Instead, I felt something steadier, calm determination. The courtroom in Suffolk County had high ceilings and tall windows that cast soft light over the polished wood. I sat at one end of the long table. 2 rows behind me sat my family. My mother wore her pearls and her favorite pale blue suit. My father's expression was unreadable, somewhere between defiance and fatigue. Claire sat between them, scrolling on her phone as if she were waiting for a train. Judge Carter entered, her expression precise, deliberate. She reviewed the files in silence before gesturing for Daniel to begin. His argument was clean, clinical. He showed how my payments had been disguised as household expenses. He detailed the unauthorized transfers, the fraudulent deed, and the misuse of the trust. He didn't raise his voice once. When he reached the part about my years of financial support, he paused, looked directly at the judge, and said, "She kept the lights on. She paid the taxes. She preserved the asset that this family tried to erase her from." The courtroom stayed silent long after he finished. When my father's attorney tried to argue that the deed was an administrative mistake, Judge Carter's tone hardened. An administrative mistake does not explain forged witnesses and expired notaries. By the end of the session, the ruling came swiftly and clearly. The fraudulent deed was void. The trust was reinstated to its original terms. The Beacon Hill house was to pass fully to me, with only a brief allowance for my mother to retrieve her belongings from the guest room and attic. The court removed my father as trustee and appointed a neutral professional for the next 6 months. Restitution to me would be calculated from the hidden accounts, and any debts falsely created in my name would revert to their rightful owners. I didn't look back as the judge's gavel came down. The clerk stamped the order, the sound sharp and final. I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in years. The house was mine. Justice didn't roar. It breathed quietly, like relief. Outside, the air was cold and clean. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps, watching the traffic flow through the streets of Boston. For the first time since that night in Chicago, I could finally see the outline of freedom taking shape. And this time, I didn't need anyone's permission to claim it. 2 weeks later, I stood on the front steps of 17 Chestnut Street with a locksmith named Peter and a roll of painter's tape tucked under my arm. The spring air carried the faint scent of lilacs from the small garden by the gate. The old house looked both familiar and foreign, its windows like quiet witnesses to everything that had happened. Peter gave me a polite nod before fitting his tools to the door. The click of the new lock was small but powerful, a single sound that marked a turning point in my life. Inside, the air smelled of dust, lemon polish, and something faintly floral. I walked through each room with a notebook in hand, taking slow, deliberate steps. My list was simple: patch the crack above the mantel, oil the hinges on the library doors, refinish the kitchen counters. But besides those tasks, I also wrote things like keep the scratch on the banister, the one I made sliding down it when I was 8, and leave the ink stain on the study desk. Some marks, I decided, were worth keeping. They were proof that I existed here once, even when no one wanted to admit it. I didn't rush to make the house perfect. Perfection had been my family's obsession. It was what drove them to bury their flaws beneath polished surfaces and forced smiles. I wanted the opposite, something real, lived in, and mine. I hired a local contractor named Robin to help with light repairs. She was practical and kind, the sort of woman who didn't mind getting paint on her jeans. Together we chose a warm white for the kitchen walls, a color that made mornings look like sunlight even on cloudy days. The old boiler wheezed like a stubborn ghost, so I replaced it entirely. The knob and tube wiring from decades ago had to go too. I paid a crew $12,400 to refinish the floors, sanding away the dullness until the oak shone again. For a week, I slept on a borrowed mattress on the floor, surrounded by open paint cans and stacked boxes. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't care. The house didn't need a grand reveal. It just needed someone to care for it. When the settlement arrived, it came with quiet efficiency. My parents were ordered to repay $128,640 within 6 months. Claire returned $24,000 from the 2 fraudulent transfers, plus interest. The new trustee sold one of my father's unauthorized investments to clear the penalties caused by my mother's withdrawals. There were no apologies, no letters, no calls. Just paperwork and silence. And for once, silence didn't hurt. It felt like closure. I kept my work in Boston for a few months, then accepted a full-time position with a design firm on Newberry Street. The salary $210,000 a year was more than I had ever earned. I saved half and invested carefully. With the rest, I created something I knew my grandfather would have loved: The Henry Collins Preservation Fund, a small scholarship for students studying architecture or historic preservation in Massachusetts. The first recipients were a young woman from Dorchester who dreamed of saving triple-decker homes and a man from Springfield, fascinated by restoring old mill buildings. The day I mailed their acceptance letters, I sat at my grandfather's old desk in the front room. The same desk where he used to write his grocery lists in neat cursive. I could almost hear his voice, steady and patient. "Keep the good things alive," he used to say. Life began to take on a rhythm again. I'd wake before sunrise, make coffee in the newly painted kitchen, and open the curtains to watch light stretch across the floorboards. On weekends, I'd visit the small farmers market on Charles Street, where vendors began to recognize me by name. Some days, I still caught myself pausing at familiar faces, people who had once been family friends. Some nodded politely. Others looked away. I learned not to take it personally. I didn't need their acknowledgement anymore. The house, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a place of peace. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, I found an old box in the attic. Inside were my grandfather's journals, leather-bound, dated, neatly stacked. The pages smelled like time itself. He had written about the house, about business, but also about me. "Lauren has a steady mind and a kind heart. She notices things others miss." I pressed my fingers to the words until they blurred. That night, I copied one of his lines onto a sticky note and placed it inside the kitchen cabinet. "Build a life that doesn't ask others to pay for your peace." In the weeks that followed, my mother sent 2 short emails, one about the weather in Florida, the other reminding me of my father's upcoming birthday. Claire posted photos from New York, smiling in rooftop restaurants, her captions full of sunshine and success. My father stayed silent. I didn't reply to any of them. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer felt the need to explain myself. Instead, I filled my days with creation. I planted hydrangeas in the back garden, choosing the kind that shift from pale blue to deep violet depending on the soil. I learned to cook properly, something I'd never done when family dinners were more performance than nourishment. On Sunday mornings, I walked along the Charles River with a thermos of coffee, watching the rowers glide across the water. The rhythm of their oars felt like a heartbeat I could finally match. People think justice is loud, that it comes with fanfare and victory speeches. But mine arrived quietly, in envelopes, in notarized documents, in doors that opened with my key instead of theirs. Justice, for me, was steady progress, repaired floors, honest paychecks, clean air. Sometimes I still catch myself standing in the hallway at dusk, listening to the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The house feels different now, lighter, freer. It's no longer the monument to their pride. It's a living, breathing thing again. And so am I. There's a quiet hour after dinner when the whole place glows. The walls hold the day's warmth, and the air smells faintly of fresh paint and wood polish. I sit in the library, reading my grandfather's notes by lamplight, and think about how far I've come from that night in Chicago when a single message ended my place in the family. But exile wasn't the end. It was the start of freedom. I don't need applause or validation. I don't need anyone to witness what I rebuilt. Every time I turn the key in the lock, every time the light spills across the floor, I'm reminded that peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from ownership of one's choices, one's truth, one's life. The house is steady. I am steady. And that, I've learned, is enough.